Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Well, hi, and welcome back to another episode of the Examined Life with Phil. First off, I just want to say I'm sorry that I missed last week. I had been suffering from a terrible migraine for about a day and a half, and my wife actually had to take me into the hospital, so I wasn't able to finish editing this podcast in time to get it out, so my apologies for that. I'm all fine now. They gave me a CAT scan, and now I'm just having to go through the horrors of fighting the bureaucracy of the VA healthcare system to try to get a follow-up appointment and then get some more treatment on it. But that's a whole nother issue that's neither here nor there. Point is, I'm fine, and we're back on schedule with this. So this week, I've got a conversation that I recorded with John Limanto on Molinism and Analytic Theology. John actually contacted me in reference to when I was looking for a guest to talk about Molinism, and he said, well, I know you already talked to Peter about this, but I'd be interested in trying to go in depth on some various aspects of how Molinism applies to other theological and philosophical considerations. And so I thought, well, hey, somebody's asking to come on the podcast. Great. And it turns out John actually lives in Indonesia, so it was a little bit of a feat for us to actually schedule a time where we could do the Skype interview, and John had to stay up very late to do that, so I again thank him for coming on the podcast and being willing to stay up so late to do this. Now, I do also want to mention that some of the conversation John and I had does get quite a bit technical and in-depth. So if you have not, I would highly recommend before listening to this one, you go back and listen to the 2 episodes I did with Peter Razor on explaining what Molinism is. Because if you're not already familiar with the concept, you're probably going to have a very hard time following some of the stuff that goes on here. Although John and I's conversation starts off much more casual than most of the other interviews I've done, we go very, very in-depth in this one. And I think it's well worth your time to listen to. I very much enjoyed having John on, and again, my thanks to him for staying up so late to do it. Here's our discussion. So, you're John. It's good to meet you as much as you can over the internet, I suppose. So
right. Yeah, and you're Phil, right?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, I know we haven't sort of talked like before and stuff like that, so I guess it's good for us to have a video chat. and one of the things that I was recording a podcast too with another guy from St. Andrews the other day, and he pointed out to me that a good thing about doing a sort of like one of these episodes, but with an actual video, is that we're actually able to give like hand gestures while we're talking. If so, like you want to switch and then you want to start talking and stuff like that, so you can just give a hand gesture and it wouldn't be an awkward kind of thing.
Yeah, there's a lot of communication that's nonverbal in facial expressions and body language, and it's a lot better to do it with video if you can, because if I make a really dry, sarcastic remark and have a smirk on my face, then you'll realize, oh, he's being sarcastic. Whereas if it was just audio only, you might be like, well, why is he being a jerk all of a sudden?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So how much do you actually know about me, by the way? Or you?
When I was looking for people for Molinism, I looked at your academia page and saw that you've done some pretty good. You've obviously written some very high-level academic stuff on Molinism, but that's about the extent of it. And I know you live in Indonesia, so that's it. So.
Yeah, I know. Maybe it's good for me to talk to you about myself first, a second. So I don't know if you know about me this way as well, but I'm actually still in high school right now. I'm just completing my high school this year, and so I've actually talked about this. So I thought that you guys would know me from my podcast at Freethinking ministries. I did a podcast where I talk about these kind of things, and I've been working on Molinism for the last 2 years or so, and so I've been really active as an admin in the Molinism group, and so you'll notice me here and there talking as an admin in the group, and been only
that's the Molinism group on Facebook, right?
Yeah, the Molinism group on Facebook, and so. Most of the stuff that I do and write about really come up from the interactions I've got from those guys at the Molinism group. And so been really doing a lot of that. And so, yeah, I think that's a basic way for me to introduce myself.
You're the first international guest I've ever had on my podcast, and you're quite literally on the other side of the world. It's a whole 12 hours difference. So where do you live in Indonesia exactly?
I live in Jakarta, which is actually the capital city of Indonesia. So it's kind of different. I mean, if you sort of like go to maybe like the more rural place of Indonesia, you won't actually find a lot of people there speaking English. And so the reason why I'm talking to you in English is because I'm here in the capital city where there is English speaking schools and stuff like that. And so I'm actually enrolled in one of them. And so that's how I came to learn English just like 6 years ago.
Oh, so English isn't your native language at all?
No,
then?
not at all. No.
Okay. Well, certainly, I converse in it like exceptionally well. There are lots of people here in the States who don't speak English quite that well, so that's really good. Good for you.
Well, thank you. That's quite flattering.
Okay. So, you're active in the Molinism group. You said you've done some work for Freethinking Ministries. Is that, I forget his name, Tim Stratton's ministry?
Yeah. I've been publishing articles there for quite a while, and also doing a podcast. I did a podcast with Tim Stratton, a couple of them. One was on divine hiddenness, and the other one was just me talking about sort of my life as a philosophy enthusiast, and also a high school kid, which is and also I did you might recognize me from a debate on Capturing Christianity. You do know Capturing Christianity, right?
I'm familiar with the ministry. I follow some of the stuff they do. He's done the guy who runs that Cameron, and I can't pronounce his last name. I'm horrible with pronouncing names unless there's something like Smith. So that's just a problem I have. I've seen some of the video interviews he's done, read a couple of the articles he's gotten some philosophers to do, and some of it's been pretty good stuff. So I
did a debate there on Molinism a couple. I think it was how many months ago? I think it was like 7 months ago or something like that. And so there was a debate on Molinism at Capturing Christianity, which I attended. And so like those two have been sort of where I'm featured in ministry. Another one was sort of maybe a smaller ministry. It was like it was by John Dunphy, and the other last one that I came on to was, of course, the podcast at Ryan Mullins. Ryan Mullins is the guy from St. Andrews who's he's done a PhD and is now a research fellow there. So,
fantastic, yeah.
Yeah. So, I've been talking about Molinism basically practically the whole time I've been online.
That's pretty odd. That's amazing that you're doing this stuff already and you're not even out of high school yet. That's really cool. Now, in Indonesia, do they run it where you do like 4 years of high school like they do in the States, or is it that run differently?
Well, I'm in the IB program, and so do you know the IB program?
I'm not familiar with that.
It's the International Baccalaureate. It's basically a curriculum from the Europe. I think it's from Swiss. So. Yes, for me, it's actually not 4 years. Actually, for me, it's actually 2 years. So I have a 2-year program where I do my high school diploma, basically. And but usually it would actually be high school. So we have, I think, high school is usually counted as the 6 years after middle school. So we have middle school, and then you do 6 years of high school in usually here, and so the last 3 years will be what we call the senior years of high school.
Cool. Okay. Well, by the way, how do you pronounce your last name? Since I'm
it's Limanto. It's Limanto.
Limanto.
Yeah,
That I
Limanto.
can actually say. Okay.
Oh, that's very good.
Yeah, Limanto. Okay. Okay, good deal. That's yeah. I tend to have a hard time with pronunciations from other languages, like from Spanish or Asian languages. But that one I can do. So it's very funny when I on podcasts and other things I do, where I'll start talking about obviously very some of the ancient Greek philosophers or some of the Roman ones. Some of those names I just cannot get right, no matter what I do. So
Yeah, if you need help, like usually what I tell people is like, because sometimes like people from the West, they can say the phrase manto, because my name is
mhm.
Lito, and they usually have no trouble saying the last part of it. But then usually they say the beginning, like Le Manto, John Limanto, you know. And
Mhm.
so what I try to remind them is like, it's like saying Bruce Lee, but with just the Lee. And so Manto.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
don't think anyone's ever had trouble pronouncing Bruce Lee. So
Yeah, I don't think so. But anyways,
okay.
yeah. So I'm also I'm also trying to time myself here, so because I try to make sure I don't get over time with just answering one of the question. And so, how long is the podcast in total in
Oh,
time?
it goes about an hour. A little more or a little less is not that big of a deal. I've had ones run as much as like an hour and 20 minutes. If it goes much longer than that, though, I usually split it up and do
Oh no, no, no!
two-parters.
I don't think it'll go longer than
Well,
that.
it's already late where you are, so appreciate
Yeah,
you being willing to come on and talk to me so late in
yeah,
the night
yeah,
where you are. But here, my mother-in-law just took my kids to the park because it's not even 11 o'clock in the morning here. So
yeah. Yeah, don't worry about that. It's high school life. You get up late and
okay.
party at night. I'm just
Well, so you'd reached out to me to want to talk about some Molinism after contacting me over the Facebook group, and I thought that was a really cool idea because Molinism definitely has, how could I put this? It seems to have more reach or potential reach for dealing with philosophical and theological issues than some of the other potential answers people give to the problem of divine hiddenness, where you can apply that Molinism into things like, say, the problem of evil or other things along those lines. And is that the kind of the direction you wanted to go in, was to talk about its broader reach, or how did you
well,
want to go?
originally I was about to help out talk about analytic theology,
Hmm.
and then but I wanted to have a focus in Molinism, and so what I like to do actually, what I'm just seeing this is that so maybe we can divide this maybe to like half half. The first half we talk about like what is the difference between like analytic theology as a
Yeah.
discipline in comparison to like normal systematic theology. And so we talk about the differences between like analytic philosophy and it's analytic philosophy and continental, and you have that as well here.
Hmm.
And also some of the like objections to the use of analytic philosophy within theology. And so maybe sort of the first half, I was thinking about sort of maybe like more about the relationship between philosophy and theology. And then the second half, we get to talking about Molinism as it's like a broad view as in itself. So I know you did another one with Peter Razor where
Yep.
you guys talk
Hmm.
about the divine foreknowledge side of Molinism. What I want to talk about here is defending Molinism as a view. So how do you make a case for Molinism? And I'm
Hmm.
going to try to outline it. Okay, so and of course, the most important one, I think, for the second part is I want to talk about um, the grounding objection, which is something that not a lot of people have resources online, and this is something I think
Yeah.
that will be very good. Um,
That's definitely the most technically astute objection to Molinism. So I was going to
yeah,
ask you how you would respond to that one. So. Hmm.
yeah. I think that's a good one. So that's my original idea. Like I was just thinking about talking about because I guess the motivation where I came from is that I was thinking that Molinism is a view that is often confused with a view from biblical theology, which is not the kind of discipline that Molinism can work in. People like the Reformed guys deny Molinism as being unbiblical, when what they really mean is that you can't get Molinism from like the Greek or the Hebrew of the Bible, which is very different than saying that Molinism is not biblical. And so I guess the reason why I wanted to do this earlier was because I wanted to sort of talk about the methodology under which Molinism works in. And of course, I think of that as analytic theology, and talk about that for sort of the first half, and then the second half talk about Molinism itself and the points of debates, and also the response to the grounding objection.
So let's just go right into it then. What you wanted to talk about, the distinction, start off talking about the distinction between analytic theology and philosophy, opposed to like the systematic approach. So tell everybody about that.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think is separating between the analytic philosophy and the continental philosophy world, I think it's the use of rhetoric that is available within each subject. So this is interesting, but Keith Green talks about Bertrand Russell in his book, and in it he makes this distinction of people doing analytic philosophy, like people working with a scrap of metals. But people doing continental philosophy, on the other hand, it's like people trying to work with a jelly. And so this difference, I think, is very interesting, because like you have a difference between a method of doing philosophy, a rhetorical method in the form of proposition-based, and also framing things in a functional sentences that can be manipulated, versus trying to do it using highly metaphorized statements, and also analogies in the form of usually they're in reference to certain German languages that are made into trying to explain the fundamental concepts of reality, like being as a subject topic. So if I may just maybe try to systemize what I'm trying to say, basically analytic philosophy has in mind what's called as intellectual clarity and precision and logical coherence, while also in the same way trying to be able to express propositions and views in terms of these sentences that can then be manipulated and then brought into various discussions. While on the other hand, you have the continental philosophers who try to work with terminologies that are highly loaded, but at the same time they're trying to analyze concepts that are fundamental, that are usually just assumed within analytic philosophy, concepts like being and goodness, and trying to further analyze them in terms of these loaded terminologies that are then likewise worked into certain metaphors and analogies. And so you have these two separation between methods of doing philosophy in general.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way to summarize it. I've, for people who aren't familiar with distinction, I've compared it to like this. You have a scientist who's trying to get at what reality is, and you have a poet who's trying to get at what reality is. The scientist is a lot more like the analytic philosopher, and the poet's a lot more like the continental philosopher. And depending on what your goal is and what you're talking about, one method may be superior to the other, because I tend to lean more to the analytic side, because I like how, like you were saying, how rigorous it is, how it strives for clarity in all things. But at the same time, I'm going to be honest enough to admit there's sometimes when it's really, really hard to be as clear and as rigorous as we want analytic philosophy to be, and then the Continental method seems to function a little bit better in those areas where we can't really define things the way we would like to.
Yeah, I think one thing to note is the importance of metaphors when it comes to subjects that are really unclear. So one thing that I need to highlight is that I'm not trying to denounce the Continental philosophers in what they do. I'm not trying to say that they're being intentionally not valuing clarity and precision.
Well, some of them are, but not all of them.
Right. But as much as they strive for clarity and precision, and that Continental philosophers just do not think that reality can be framed in terms of clarity and precision. Yes. And so there is an attempt to write clearly, or just the basic academic way of doing things. But of course, the difference here is that the analytic philosopher thinks you can talk about reality in a clear and precise way, while the Continental philosophers think, no, you can't. And so you have to talk about things in this highly metaphorical senses when it comes to talking about like God, or talking about metaphysics in general. And so that's the distinction that I think is helpful.
Yeah. And that's actually, I would say, kind of a fundamental question, whether or not you can talk about God and metaphysics in a more analytic sense, or you have to talk about it in a more continental metaphorical sense. And a lot of other things you think about, philosophy and metaphysics, are probably going to dictate how you come down on that. Whereas I think an example of something like, if you're talking about aesthetics or beauty, that probably just automatically lends itself to a continental method better than an analytic one, because you and I could probably compare works of art and agree, well, these paintings are better than these paintings, and all these paintings are better than, say, a garbage dump somewhere. But then can we analytically rigorously define that, where we're like, this painting has a beauty value of 9.9 and this one's a beauty value of 9.65? Well, no, probably not.
Yeah, but I do think that at least one of them is superior when we're talking about theology in particular, at least in relation to what we want to do or what we want to accomplish for modern day theology. And I think, this is where the issue of analytic theology comes in, because we're talking about how do you talk about theology meaningfully? And of course, Kallberg said that whenever you open your mouth, you're doing philosophy. And so the point of it all is that there needs to be a way of doing theology that is beyond just articulating it in terms of biblical languages. So it's good for you to articulate things in biblical languages. But of course, if you talk about, like, in terms of, for example, a dictionary, you can't talk about a word in terms of its own word when you're trying to define it. In the same way, when it comes to like these theological questions, you need to be able to define things and work with them in some extra biblical senses. And I think this is where I really think that the analytic method has a certain superiority here in articulating theological concepts.
Okay, so what do you think makes it superior? Why do you find that to be the better method?
Yeah, so, well, I think that at the very root of it, one thing that separates analytic theology and perhaps maybe the theology of the 19th century liberalism, which is highly continental, is the ability of falsification. So this understanding of a theory in theology being put up as this is how you can falsify it, I think it's a very precious theory in theology. And the reason why, and let me just give you an example. Suppose we in the notion of like, let me just think of a theological concept here that's good. Suppose we talk about the hypostatic union, right? And this is my favorite example. We talk about the dual nature in Christ, and we talk about that. Now, the problem that I think persists in theology for the last 2,000 years or so is being able to find out, is our theory superior to another theory or not? Or are we even talking about the same thing when you're using the language, for example, the dialectic of Hegel, of talking about the culmination, the zeitgeist of reality? Is that the same thing as when you're using the language of the Council of Chalcedon 451, where you talk about the hypostasy of within the person of Christ? So I think being able to identify whether your theory first is the same thing as another theory, or second, whether your theory is able to overcome certain concrete challenges. I think those things really require ability for your theory to be falsified and for you to be able to express your theory in some concrete, precise, and coherent way, rather than bringing in a certain metaphysical system, such as, for example, Hegel's dialectic, that really is using these metaphors, for example, that really can't be pinned down to a certain concept that you can say, oh, that's where this differs from the idea of the bishops in Chalcedon, for example, or for example, this is where I see difficulty in your system because here is the logical incoherence. Whereas Continental philosophers really do not allow for talk of logical coherence as a way to disprove their theory. And I think that's
generally speaking, no. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's a problem.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think coherence is one of the necessary but not sufficient conditions of truth. If your theory isn't coherent, it's not going to be true. Full stop. So.
Yeah, and I think, one thing that we see advances in, of course, is when it comes to talking about certain doctrines, like the doctrine of the Trinity. For a certain number of centuries, we've been plagued with, well, maybe plague is not the right word, but with the dominant view of the Western the Eastern Christianity has been what's called as the Latin Trinitarianism. And of course, the Latin Trinitarianism has been sort of the prevailing view within Christendom as a whole. But one thing that has set the doctrine of Trinity apart from a lot of these other doctrines of Christianity is we have really not been able to make sense of it until the rise of social Trinitarianism in 20th century, when we really talk about the Trinity in terms of the languages of personhood of analytic philosophy. And so this is a case where we really have been stuck in a theological concept and we have not been able to advance it in doctrine. Why? Well, because for the last centuries or so, we have been so focused in trying to talk about it, not in logical coherence, but simply in being able to frame it analogically. We're trying to talk about it in certain languages and find a new loaded terminology. If you don't talk about it about subsistences, then you can't be in a Trinitarian kind of thing, Well, it is the rise of social Trinitarianism, which is an example of a doctrine which really furders the talk of theology for the last centuries or so, that really wasn't progressing because our focus is more on these terminologies that are loaded, as opposed to logical coherence and precision.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I all in favor of precision. So, what are the main objections that you find to this more analytic approach that values coherence and precision and looks for ways to, no, that's not the right phrase, that tries to give us some criteria by which we can evaluate our philosophical and theological theories and compare them and say, well, like you were just getting at, this theory of the Trinity is superior to this theory of the Trinity, and here's why. So what are some of the main objections to doing it that way?
Yeah, so I guess the main objections really come, mainly speaking, from the Reformed community, and we're starting to see a lot more focus in terms of the debate on the use of reasoning. And one such objection is that God is really a being that can't be talked of in terms of proper reason. And that's because God is beyond reasoning. God is beyond ability to be comprehended. And of course, usually the talk of this comes when in reference to the doctrine of divine simplicity, when you're talking about whether or not, you can make sense of God and that kind of thing, right? And so
debates around that, yes.
Right. And so people in the Thomist group like to say that God is in a certain sense incomprehensible as an actus purus. And so this is just an example where they will talk of God as being beyond reason. Now, I guess, this is one, I would say, dominant objection to it. Well, another objection.
Can I just interject there? I would say that you're right about that, but even the Thomists would then say, well, we can talk of God analogically. We can say, when we say that God is love, it's not the same thing as when I, Phil, say I love my wife. It's not univocal terms. They're not one-to-one. But there's something analogical there. So even though it's not perfect, we can still talk of God in a certain sense. But they do complicate it a bit, like you're saying there.
Right. Yeah, you're right.
Which is a whole nother discussion that I've argued with my Thomist friends about, because I've often said, I think you have a point there, but I'm not sure it goes that far. So maybe at some point in the future, I'll get one of my Thomist friends on and we'll hash that out. But that is a whole other big can of worms. So.
Yeah, no, don't worry about it. I think it's a good point to bring up, because there is really even people who don't buy into the idea that God can be talked of reasonably still does bring in certain ways that we can talk about God at the very
everybody least. Who does philosophy or theology talks about who and what God is. You just do. So
right. So I mean, you can't fully say that you don't want to talk about God if you're a theologian to begin with. But anyway, setting aside maybe one of those polemics, I think another maybe more serious objection is in terms of the discipline of analytic theology that is highly divested of getting into the roots of sort of the biblical languages. So this is one of maybe the more serious criticisms out there with respect to our Reformed brethren, where they would say that the talk of like possible worlds that analytic philosophers and analytic theologians talk about usually really do not warrant to be within theology. Why? Because those stuff are foreign metaphysics that are imposed on the Bible. And so you really cannot talk about theology in analytic senses, because analytic senses really take away the motivation for us to seek sort of this biblical and highly biblical in the sense of the textual basis of the Bible. You're discouraging people to get to the Bible because you're imposing foreign languages and metaphysics into the Bible. And so I think those two are sort of the main objections. Do you want to make some comments on them? Or
Yeah. Well, my thought would be that there are definitely cases where we impose contemporary understandings of things back on Scripture. I gave an essay about a month ago at the Society for Pentecostal Studies meeting in Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C., where I argued we do that with our concept of what it means to have an error and truthfulness, because the central argument is, if you talk to your average person who would have been reading and writing 2,000 years ago, they had a little bit of a broader understanding of how you write truthfully than we do now, where now we've been so influenced by precision and engineering and stuff that we assume you need a high level of precision. That's why we have things like quotation marks and commas and things like that in our languages, where they didn't have that 2,000 years ago. And so often we impose our contemporary understanding of precision back on Paul and the gospel authors and things like that, and it's wrong to do so. So I think there are cases where we are taking our philosophy, our metaphysics, so on, and imposing it back on the authors of Scripture in ways that are wrong. But I don't quite see how most of the conceptions you get in analytic philosophy are that way, because those seem to be very much more grounded in basic logic like coherence rather than things like a contemporary understanding of precision in engineering. So
Yeah, well, maybe one way to eliminate this objection is to talk about that the biblical authors would have had absolutely no conception of analytic philosophy. So they would say, I think here's one way to eliminate this objection. And once again, I'm not claiming that this objection is something that's widely defended or perhaps strongly settled in the academia. In fact, analytic theology is a very new movement. And so I'm just, most of these objections really are objections that come up along the way. They're just sparsely located in the literature and they're not solidly built into the literature. But in any case, I think one possibility is to say that the biblical authors really did not have the intention of talking, for example, let's say, for example, we're talking about the Trinity. The biblical authors would have had no idea of the analytic modern concept of personhood. For example, of the Trinity in terms of a society of three persons, and defining personhood in such a technical terms. They will say rather that these biblical authors, if any, would have had been regarded, would have some influences from their Hellenistic philosophy, which is highly different than analytic philosophy in general. And so here's one way to maybe perhaps pursue the objection. Although you're right that the objection itself is still highly underdeveloped as it is.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let me try to respond to these objections to begin with. And let's begin with the first one. So we have the first one, which is the objection that, oh my goodness, what was the first one that I brought in again? Sorry, let me just start again.
We were just talking about the fact that they wouldn't have had those terms and concepts. I'm having a hard time recalling off the top of my head what your first one was too.
Oh, no, don't worry about it. No, I remember the first one. I remember the second one is about that it discourages people from the Bible. The first one would have been you're imposing the foreign metaphysics.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, okay, let me start again. So let's begin by responding to this objection. Let me try to respond to them this way. So we have first the objection that you're imposing foreign metaphysics into the Bible. And I think this is a good objection on face value, because at least it sounds like we're imposing on the Bible what was not taught there. But one way of us being able to get out of this objection is to recognize that when you're doing explication of the Bible, that is, when you explicate the Bible beyond the biblical languages, whatever you do, you will still be engaging in some sort of these discourses that that analytic philosophers do.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe let me give an example, right? And the example that I may give again is in terms of the doctrine of predestination. So, for example, we can talk about verses where it talks about us being adopted, or it talks about that we have been predestined in him before the foundation of the world. And so when we're talking about these things and we're trying to explain what they mean, whatever you do, you will have to resort to some extra biblical languages anyways. So my response to the first objection is really that what it means for a metaphysics to be foreignly imposed on the Bible. And yes, you're right, Phil, that there is a case where this can happen, where you are imposing on the Bible something that's really bad. And of course, we have the example of the 19th century liberal who imposed Hegelian philosophy into the Bible. What makes such imposition bad in comparison to what we're doing in analytic philosophy is really just because in analytic philosophy, our way of using the metaphysics to explicate the Bible involves a reconciliation of various views. So this is an important aspect. We try to reconcile various views, and we're not trying to support or force a view from the existing doctrines. And so here's a good example to bring this up. But in terms of 19th century liberalism, an example would be the doctrine of justification. In 19th century liberalism, for example, they have the doctrine of justification that they elaborate in terms of Hegel's dialectic. And they say that, the conflict between Jesus and the Jews, which they interpret to be like the conflict there, but really it wasn't a conflict between Jesus and the Jews. Of course, Jesus was a Jew himself, but they interpret that to be a conflict between Jesus and the Jews or the Pharisees in terms of the dialectic. So they would say that, what Jesus was doing when he confronted the Pharisees was a dialectic between sort of the thesis and the antithesis. Now, notice that what we're doing actually in such a scenario is that we're actually trying to prove a certain metaphysics, or we're trying to prove a certain metaphysics from the biblical passage that really doesn't prove that certain metaphysics. So we're trying to support a metaphysics using biblical references that really do not support that idea. But on the other hand, what is the analytic philosopher doing? Well, the analytic philosopher, in trying to talk, for example, about the Trinity, is trying to locate a certain end goal, and this end goal is always a biblical doctrine. For example, the end goal of social Trinitarianism is to talk about the persons of the Trinity in a logically coherent way. Now, the way to do that, of course, the means to arrive to that may be not extra biblical in the sense of using extra biblical languages, such as the one in analytic philosophy, but at least the goal of it all is still aimed towards a doctrine that is really what the Bible, what we deem the Bible to be trying to support, rather than us having the Bible be a support towards something that it really is not, which I think is a way in which you impose foreign metaphysics into the Bible.
Okay. Well, that seems to work to me. So, why don't we just move on then? And you'd indicated you'd like to talk about some more developments in modern debates in analytic theology and Molinism. So why don't we move on to that topic?
Yeah. So the reason why I wanted to talk about Molinism as well was because I believe that Molinism has really been one of the progresses that has been made in theology through the use of analytic philosophy. So how have we progressed, really? Well, we have to note that up until the discovery of Molinism by Alvin Plantinga in the 20th century, we really did not have much of an alternative beyond, for example, the standard Thomism or the standard determinist Calvinist movement, or the simple foreknowledge view of the Arminians. So we really have very limited ways in trying to understand how it is that God can work in the world, and also be able to be fully provident, and also the creature being fully free. And so one of the development, and I think this is an important one, is that we've really been able to explain the problem of evil through Molinism. We've really been able to progress that far, which is an issue that really did not feel, that a lot of philosophers did not feel to be resolved up until Alvin Plantinga responded to John Mackey in the 1970s. And so this is a key progress, because we're talking about a progress in which we have really been able to come up with a model that defends Christianity against its sort of most feared enemy, which is the problem of evil. So I think, that would be a really big one.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more there. I've read plenty of Plantinga, and he kind of stumbled across Molinism, which was first, as I'm sure you well know, proposed by Luis Molina when he was working on the problem of evil. And his free will defense has been so successful that, with a few noted exceptions in contemporary philosophy of religion, the logical problem of evil has all but been abandoned. There's one or two philosophers who don't quite agree and think it still works, but they're the vast minority. Pretty much everybody else agrees, yeah, Plantinga moved the ball for us here and really advanced things. Yeah. Oh, I can't hear you. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, so I think that analytic theology and really can be applied for Molinism as well. And I think, in terms of progress and what we can do, one of the problems that has been lurking behind doctrines like Molinism is really the lack of a clear articulation of what methodology this doctrine really works under. So, for example, in terms of Molinism, it's not clearly delineated whether Molinism should be operated as a biblical theological doctrine, which would be on par with, for example, the concept of atonement, or, for example, the doctrine of divine sovereignty. These are doctrine which we would consider to fall under the academic discipline of biblical theology. But does Molinism fall to this? Well, it really doesn't seem like that. For one thing, we really don't derive Molinism from the original languages from the Bible. It's not like Luis de Molina was reading Greek from the New Testament. I think he stumbled on Molinism, right? At least not. Yeah. Right. So we have to understand that at least there needs to be some clear methodology that needs to be defined for doctrines like Molinism. And I think analytic theology really helps here, in the sense that analytic theology provides how it is that Molinism can be both a philosophical and also a theological doctrine. And I think this is the way in which we can really move forward in our discussion. So here's maybe a good way to put it. But, in theology, there's a way of defending, a certain method of defending a doctrine. And that's usually in the form of being able to defend it through certain exegesis of certain verses, or being able to derive it from some historical aspect of the church.
Yeah, you appeal to scripture or appeal to tradition, essentially.
Yeah, that's right. But the problem is, of course, Molinism, although it can appeal to certain aspects of history, or also appeal to certain data from the Bible, such as when it talks about divine sovereignty and all the like, and human free will, it really isn't the kind that can be defended by this alone. And so you go on ahead and you go to the philosophical articulation of Molinism. And this is where philosophy defends Molinism very well, But you realize that you need both of them, the philosophical side and also the biblical side of theology, that both combines to present a cumulative case for Molinism. So I think this is the sense in which we say Molinism is biblical. We say that Molinism is biblical in the sense that, we're able to defend it in the methodology of analytic theology, that it gains, that it reconciles biblical concepts, but through articulations that are extra biblical. And so this will be the same on par with like the doctrine of hypostatic union that I was saying earlier. It's an explication, it's a reconciliation of these highly, highly biblical concepts, such as the human nature of Christ and the divine nature of Christ. It's a reconciliation of the two concepts using a model that is both philosophical, but also it's a model that seeks to establish something that's hugely, hugely important to the Bible. And so I think, as a sort of final remark on this topic, when we're talking about sort of how it is that Molinism can be aided by analytic theology, really we talk about it in terms of being able to form a clear methodology for Molinism, be able to articulate how it is that Molinism is biblical, and also be able to present concrete arguments for Molinism. In terms of, for example, a case from reductio, we can say that Molinism is true because the alternatives to Molinism is unlikely to be true. We say that, and then we likewise talk about reconciling different doctrines and how that requires Molinism as the reconciling factor to it. And so, that will be what I would say to it. And I'll let you speak about it too.
Well, I was going to say that's what Peter Razor actually said, is how he looked at it. Is he said, well, I go with Molinism mostly because it seems to me that all the other alternatives don't work, and Molinism is the one that's left. And he also had something in which I thought was very, very wise, where he said, I don't approach it as if it's this is my terminology. I don't approach Molinism as if it is the gospel truth. I don't think of it in the same way that I would think of, say, the resurrection of Christ, where that's just flatly, obviously taught in Scripture. There's no way you can read the Gospels and turn around and deny that, honestly, that it teaches that Christ was resurrected. Where Molinism, he says, I view that as a theological or philosophical system where I'm trying to make sense of all these different things. It's a theory that makes sense of it. But, if somebody came along in 5 or 10 years and gave me a better theory that made sense of all the data we see in Scripture and our experiences in philosophy better, I'd be fine with going with that. Molinism's just the best theory that I see right now, which I thought was a very, very healthy and good approach to doing theology and philosophy, and I wish more people would actually kind of look at a lot of their theories more like that, where it's like, well, maybe somebody will come along in 10 years and have a better theory, and that's okay. I'll go with that if that happens. So.
Yeah, well, that's good. Actually, it's the reason why I really appreciate that is because it really highlights that we really shouldn't be cage stage Molinists, so to say.
Yes.
Yeah. But it really means is that, we have the saying cage state Calvinist, which means a Calvinist who really can't be convinced otherwise, and he's just really in his own sort of echo chamber. And so. Yeah,
I had a Calvinist on the show about a month or so ago, giving his explanation of these issues, and even he referenced that and kind of was like saying, there's something kind of wrong with people who fall into that trap. And I certainly wouldn't have said that Tim was one of those people himself. He's actually, even though we argued and didn't agree, he was quite a bit reasonable. He wasn't shouting at me. So
yeah. And so I think that's a highly virtuous approach. It's to simply say that I see Molinism as the one that makes sense of the most data, but I don't think of Molinism as essential to Christianity. And I think that's a really important approach as well, to recognize that as a model of analytic theology, it really isn't equivalent in our epistemic acceptance of it, in our epistemic certainty of it, in the level of say, the resurrection, or likewise, for example, the doctrine of the Christologies that we have, or our doctrine of, for example, inspiration. But we also notice, we also should not forget that it is still at least on par with some doctrines, like, for example, the doctrine of compatibilism. Like Calvinists really like to say, oh, compatible is freedom is what we hold to. But, if you hold to compatibilism, then you're also holding to something that is just as philosophical, just as theological as Molinism is, or
I
at
would
least,
say that from what I've read in the philosophy of mind, compatibilism is actually probably the dominant view among most philosophers of mind who aren't also religious or Christian. That if you would go to a secular university and your average naturalist philosopher is probably going to hold to that viewpoint, which just demonstrates what you're saying. That that's a philosophical viewpoint that you're then taking and using to make sense of what you find in Scripture and elsewhere.
Yeah, so you're right. And so I think it's important to recognize both of these. That first, Molinism really isn't on par with essential Christian doctrines. But on the other hand, Molinism still is better in explaining the data in comparison to its friends, such as compatibilism or determinism, Calvinism. And so we need not to recognize that determinism, Calvinism somehow has superior benefits in terms of biblical support, which it really doesn't. And I think that's a very wise way to defend Molinism.
Okay. Well, I like to ask everybody who advocates a viewpoint to kind of defend what they're claiming against the popular objections. And so I put these objections to Peter when he was coming on talking about Molinism. So I'll put them to you, as you're well familiar with them. There's the grounding objections to Molinism, which is it posits that God has knowledge of what we would do in any situation, and it follows from that God, I've got 3 younger brothers. If one of them had been a sister, which did not happen, God would have knowledge of what that woman would be like, what kind of preferences she would have, whether or not she would like coffee, what kind of life she would have, and what decisions she would make. But that person obviously doesn't exist. I've never had a sister. It's highly unlikely I ever will. So then there's the obvious question, how could God have knowledge of someone who does not exist? And that's what I find is the best way to state the grounding objection, which is it requires God to have knowledge of all kinds of basically infinite things like this, but it's kind of hard to see how you can have knowledge of something that does not exist.
Yeah. Well, the grounding objection is perhaps the one that philosophers point to and say that that's the reason Molinism is false. And I think you have a really good way of putting it, which is about a person who doesn't exist. How do you have a knowledge about someone who doesn't exist? And the thrust of this objection, if I may try to rephrase it in my own terms, is that the grounding objector is trying to say that there is really nothing in the world that makes true these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. And once again, when we're talking about Molinism, we're talking about counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, which are, I hope that our listeners here do understand what that means. It's these statements about what anyone would do in different circumstances. So what I would do if I were born in Japan or whatever, And so
what I would do if I was the president of the United States, which is probably why I'm not the president of the United States, because God knows how badly that would go. So,
yeah, you're right. And it's this counterfactuals really do not have its root in or its ground in whatever thing it really exists in the world. And we like to put it in terms of the truth maker theory. And this is one way to understand it. So suppose that we have a proposition, and this proposition is the proposition car exists. And we ask ourselves, what makes true the proposition cars exist? Now, it's natural for you to say it's the existence of cars. The existence of cars, the fact that someone, Obama owns a car somewhere out there in the world, that
Yeah, it's
his
easy. You can just point to them and say, "See, yeah, they're right there. They exist. I can point to
right,
them." So, yeah.
right, and that's why the proposition is true, right? And so, and likewise, we would say about the future and the past. The future is true because it will be at least exemplified, whereas the present, whereas statements of counterfactuals are often about creatures that do not exist. So I think that's my way of phrasing it. Do you think that's a fair way to understand
Oh,
it?
yeah. That's a very fair way to say it. The problem, like you're saying, the problem seems to be how can you have a grounding? How can you have a truth-making property for a counterfactual if there's nothing in reality to ground it to tie it to?
Yeah.
It's sort of like, for people who aren't familiar with the philosophical language, when we're talking like we are now, when we're using words, most words are a referent to an actual thing. Like if I talk about my computer, well, my computer's right here. I talk about John, well, you're sitting there in Indonesia on the other side of the world right now. There's a referent to the words I'm using. That's because the referent actually really exists. Where the problem, what we're getting at here with the grounding objection is, there doesn't seem to be a referent for these counterfactuals. There doesn't seem to be anything in the actual world where we can say this is what grounds it. Yeah, so I think you've described the problem pretty well.
Yeah, so the standard Molinist response to this is really to question the assumption that all things really need to correspond, or at least to be made true, by something that is concrete. And let me put it this way. So there are statements that we deem to be true, although they are not made true by something that is concrete, that exists. And by concrete, I mean something that is causally active. For example, like your dog is a concrete object. Your dog isn't an abstract object, or
as we all heard from embarking. Yeah.
It simply means that your dog is causally active. It can cause something, and so, for example, but the problem is, like, a lot of things, a lot of statements that we make really do not abide by this rule. For example, if I were to say there exists no unicorns, when I'm making that statement, I'm making a statement about something that is true, which is that unicorns don't exist. But what makes true the statement unicorns don't exist? Well, that's problematic, because you see now that we're coming to a case in which our referent isn't really a concrete object. Now, here's maybe another interesting one. Suppose that we have, suppose that I have my glass. I have a window, and it's made out of glass, and so suppose that I'm throwing a ball at it, and I know the following counterfactual. I know the counterfactual that if the ball were to hit the window, the glass would break and shatter to pieces or whatever. That counterfactual is grounded. You can ask that counterfactual is reasonably true, which is that if I throw a ball to my window, then the glass will break, the window will break. And so, but what makes true the statement? Well, we might say it would be the molecular structure of the window. The molecular structure of the glass makes it that it's fragile, and so if you throw a ball at the glass, it would break. But the problem is, notice that it's not only the glass, the molecular structure, but it is likewise the law of nature surrounding it. The law of nature, which is the law of nature that describes that this glass will break if a certain ball were to hit it or whatever. But the problem is, now we come to another statement that is also not grounded in a causally active concrete object, which is law of nature. Anything that constitutes law of nature, for example, the law of gravity, is not a concrete object. You don't have an entity that really exists, which we call the law of gravity, that we point to and say, oh, that's the law of gravity. And so that's the sense in which we talk about that sometimes some of our statements really do not refer to concrete entities or concrete objects. And so if that's the case, what I would like to propose is that the Molinists here can have no problem, because they can just say that, like the laws of nature, we have counterfactuals of creaturely freedom that are grounded in this state of affairs. So let me distinguish that for a second. We have entities that we introduced earlier, or objects that we said, or states of affairs. States of affairs really can just be under the exemplification of a certain proposition. So you can have the state of affair of Socrates playing a flute, for example, which is really the state of affairs, which is the exemplification of the proposition that Socrates is playing a flute. So in such a case, then you can have a case in which you have a proposition and you use what's called as the disquotational principle. What you really is doing is you're taking the state of affairs out of that proposition. So the proposition Socrates is playing a flute, and then the state of affairs of Socrates playing a flute. And so you can derive a state of affairs out of any proposition. And so what the Molinists can do is Molinists can also propose the state of affairs of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. This is the same thing as if you're saying that there are state of affairs of laws of nature. If I say that there is a state of affairs of that the apple will fall if I drop the apple, then that's a state of affairs which correspond to a law of nature. And likewise, it's the same thing with counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. They work like laws of nature in the sense that they're non-concrete entities, but they can still be grounded in a state of affairs. So I hope that analogy there is clear. Yeah. So far, do you think it's a clear way of putting it?
I think that's a very good response. It's very similar to the problem of universals in philosophy, where the easy example of that is we all want to say that there's a color blue, but you've never actually seen the color blue disconnected from things. You'll see it on your computer screen. You'll see a blue car. You might see blue water depending on how the weather is that day. You never see blue just by itself. So then the problem is, well, we all want to say that blue exists, but really does it? All you've ever seen are the particular examples. Yeah. And so what you're getting at is very similar to that, where, well, we want to say things like the laws of nature exist, like the law of gravity, the various laws of physics that be involved with the window shattering, for obvious reasons. But have you ever actually seen or observed the law? No, you've observed lots of individual instances, and then you kind of abstract and infer from that law is there. And so what you're saying is we're going to do something similar with the counterfactuals and say, well, they're like the universals, they're like the laws of nature, where, yeah, you can't really look at them in this grand sense and say, aha, but you can point to lots of little individual instances and then kind of infer from that.
Oh, that's actually,
is that accurate?
Yeah. Well, the last part where you said that we can infer counterfactuals from what we perceive from the counterfactuals we see in real life, I think that's a very interesting one as well, because we do see that laws of nature, we infer to laws of nature from certain phenomena that we see in our world, and then we infer from it that therefore there are laws of nature, although we really don't know what grounds it or whatever.
We've never observed the law of gravity. What we've observed is matter attracts matter, things fall down all the time, and from that we've inferred the law of gravity.
Yeah, and I think it's one way as well, one good way to try to argue for Molinism is to say that even if you don't know the grounding for it, you can argue for it in the same way that you argue for example, the existence of laws of nature, because you see phenomena that are so similar to it in real life. For example, that I see, that I know that certain people in my life will never ever in their life eat a burrito because that's just not good for them. And so what an example of this can then be extrapolated to, for example, deriving that there are these counterfactuals, even though we don't know the grounding for it. Now that's another way to put it. But what I was getting at earlier was that we do know the grounding for it, and the grounding is really just the state of affairs of these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, which is the same thing as the state of affairs of laws of nature that we described earlier. But well, I think that point is very helpful, though. Thank you for bringing that up.
Oh yeah, that's a pretty good response to the grounding objection, I think. There are two other objections to Molinism I've heard people give, although I don't think these ones are quite as strong or as interesting. The first one is that all this really does is, so to speak, push the problem back a step, where, and this is one I put to Peter as well, that God can still determine what we're going to do. He just has to then, so to speak, be pretty crafty about it. So my favorite example of this is God wanted Paul to write the book of Romans. Now, because of middle knowledge and counterfactuals, he knows what Paul's going to write depending on where Paul is. So he knows what Paul would write if Paul was in Alexandria. He knows what Paul would write if Paul was in Athens. And he knows what Paul would write if Paul was in Romans, and he wants Paul to write Romans, so he arranges the world so that Paul will be in Rome and write Romans. Now, the objection that people make is, well, it's sort of like God's entrapping Paul then, because he put Paul in a situation where Paul would just, so to speak, freely choose things, but God's also determined it at the same time by arranging the worlds that way. So what would you say to that objection?
Yeah, I would like to begin by quipping something that William Hasker talks about. So William Hasker has a funny way of putting Molinist responses. He says that every time you give a Molinist an objection, the way that the Molinist can respond is either only in two ways. The first is saying, yeah, but, or saying, so what? And I would like to say that my response is so what kind of thing. Now, what I mean is this, and this is I think a good way of putting it. But what I mean by so what is really that although it is true that God has in fact made it certain that Paul writes the book of Romans, for example, by putting him in the circumstances and everything, one thing that is still fulfilled is libertarian free will. So as long as libertarian free will is fulfilled and the criteria for it is fulfilled, it still means that therefore Paul does and is and was responsible for writing the book of Romans, despite him having written it in certainty after the circumstances have been placed. Now, I think the interesting objection, though, that's usually brought up here is the issue of, is God responsible then for the actions of Paul? Now, I think this is a quite different objection, but it's still an interesting one, and it's worth responding to. If God, for example, makes it the case that a rapist were to be put in a circumstance where he rapes a little girl, is God responsible for putting that circumstance and all the like? Now, I think this is the one that's really serious. But here's where I deviate from the so what answer to a yeah but kind of thing.
Yeah.
This is where I say the issue that the non-Molinist is not seeing properly is that the Molinist is really trying to say that God is responsible for putting in the circumstances, but the intention of him putting the circumstances can still be justified if there is a certain end to which God can bring it about. So, for example, in the case of the rapist and the little girl. Now, for example, the case of God putting rapist in a particular circumstance, of course, we can say that God is responsible for putting those circumstances. But we have to understand that in grand scheme of things, it's really not just about that particular event. The circumstances that lead to the rapist, for example, the couple that give birth to the rapist, for example, or the little girl who happens to stand by, all of that is still part of other circumstances that God still has to ensure all of them will bring it about the final end good for all of reality, which is, the blessedness of people in heaven and the punishment of the sinners in hell. And so in this grand scheme of things, all of these circumstances are so interconnected with each other that in the case of God putting a certain circumstance that may lead to a bad event, that putting of that circumstance is still justified under the existence of the insurmountable good that the events lead up to, the whole interconnectedness of all of these events lead up to, which is, we would say, it would be the heavenly bliss of the saved.
Okay, yeah, that's a pretty good response too. The only other one I'm aware of is the idea that what Molinism does is it makes a distinction between the fact of God's knowledge and the content of God's knowledge, and then makes the content of God's knowledge dependent on us human beings. And you can, it's a little bit loose to say it this way, but you could, so to speak, say that what Molinism does is it takes the traditional problem of divine foreknowledge and reverses it, which is, it's not the case that when I drink a cup of coffee this afternoon, I'm going to do it because God knows it. Rather, it's the case that God knows it because that's what I'm going to do. And so I've heard some people, both from like Thomistic strains of philosophy and theology, and I think also from more like what you were referencing before, the more Reformed or Calvinistic responses, say, well, that makes God too dependent on us. We want to be dependent on God, not the other way around.
Yeah, so I've heard this objection a lot of times, and you're right, it's very, very popular. But one thing I would like to ask them is, in what sense God really depends on us? And so, and this is, I think, where the problem lies, is that a lot of times these Thomists really define dependence in terms of that if God knows everything, not because of his decree, then it means that God depends on something else outside of himself. But of course, that will not be a problem for Molinism exclusively. It's not an exclusive problem for Molinism. Anyone who holds to libertarian free will would be prone to that problem. In fact, anybody who doesn't hold to determinism, Calvinism, would be prone to that problem. Anyone who doesn't hold that God causally determines that I eat my breakfast today, that person is somehow now guilty of some heresy that this guy is making up. So I think that the first point I would like to bring up is that this is really not an issue that Molinists have to be alone in, or something that exclusively excludes Molinism. But I think a more interesting way to put it is that the sense in which God the sense in which Thomists say that God depends on creatures in Molinism really isn't true in the final analysis. And let me explain it this way. When they talk about dependence, they're talking about that if these creatures do not exist, then God therefore would not be as essentially good as he is, or as essentially maximally great as he is. God wouldn't be the being that he is now because he needs those creatures in order for him to be the being he is now. So that's usually the line of argument that's brought up, is that if God is to be the creature that he is, then he needs the creatures. Because why? Because those creatures give him his knowledge. But what I would like to say here is that there needs to be a distinction between what's called as God's essence and his accidental properties. And this is not a distinction that Thomists would like to buy, but I still think that it's a distinction that is worth bringing, because it's a distinction that we non-Thomists talk about. We talk about God in his essence as different than God in his accidental properties. So we still do maintain that God does have accidental properties, such as, for example, his knowing that you and I will eat breakfast tomorrow and the kind of food we will eat. But these things really do not constitute God in his essence. And therefore, even if his knowledge would have been different, had there been different creatures, it doesn't mean that he depends on those creatures for his essence, because his essence is different than his accidental properties. And it's only the change in his accidental properties that's made, but it doesn't affect him in his essence. So I think that would be how I would argue in terms of talking about God's dependence. God really doesn't depend on creatures. Why? Because he doesn't need those creatures to be in his essence. His essence remains untouched by these creatures' doings and all the like.
Well, that's a very good response. You're just full of all kinds of great responses to these objections. Yeah.
Thank you.
I've often thought that one kind of confuses the ontology a little bit, where we want to say that ontologically speaking, all of us are dependent on God because he's the very ground of everything. He's being with a capital being. But it doesn't necessarily follow from that all of the knowledge God has of what we do is also ontologically foundational in that same sense. It's sort of like, yeah. So I haven't come up with a good analogy for that one yet, but
I think the Thomists though would like to bring in the issue of dependence in terms of a conditional. So they'll say that they'll say that God depends in his knowledge for you, for example, to you, for example, in the sense that had you not existed, God would not have known that you will eat your breakfast tomorrow. At least God knows it's a possibility that you will eat your would eat your breakfast. But God doesn't know that at time T, Phil Kallberg will eat his breakfast. So that's I'm just bringing it up to be charitable.
If Molinism is true, then God knows that regardless of whether or not I existed. So.
You're right. And I guess I would just respond still in the same way that I responded. But I think you did bring up an important point, which is that it really doesn't matter. You really shouldn't use the word dependence here, because it's not as though God depends. God needs this knowledge in the beginning. God doesn't need this knowledge in the beginning. It's just that the dependence is in the sense of God sustaining the creature, God the big B being, not in the sense of God needing knowledge about you, I suppose.
Okay. Well, I think I'm about at the end of the notes we prepared for our discussion. Did you have anything else you wanted to say or to wrap up or anything like that?
Oh, no. I think I'm good.
Okay. Well, you'd mentioned that you'd done some blogging for Freethinking Ministries. If people wanted to find out more about you, could they find that at their website, or where could they go to find out some of the writing and stuff that you've done?
Yeah, so you can go to my academia page, which is, you can Google it up. Likewise, I have done articles on the truth maker theory in the Freethinking Ministry. I have also done numerous other ones. So you can just go to freethinkingministry.com, and then you search up in the search bar. You can search up my name there, John Limanto, and you'll find some articles there from me. You can likewise watch my debate at Capturing Christianity that I did with Andrew Harlan Smith about a year ago. And so, yeah.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, it's about midnight where you're at right now, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Thanks for contacting me and suggesting this, and thanks for staying up so late to do it. I really appreciate it so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome, and thank you as well from me for letting me be here. And so,
Happy to do it. I love having good philosophical and theological discussions. That's what I'm all about. Okay. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed listening to John and I's discussion as much as we enjoyed having it. I know I had a really good time, and he told me he did too. So now, as always, it's time for you to give me some feedback. Write in and let me know what you think. What do you think about John's response to the grounding objection to Molinism? I was pretty impressed with his response myself. What do you think about any of the topics we dealt with in general? Do you have any thoughts or comments? Write in and let me know. You can always reach me at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com. And I've got the Facebook group, The Examined Life with Phil. You can leave a comment there. And as always, if you like what I'm doing on the podcast, share it on social media. Find us on Apple iTunes and give me a rating there. I guess it helps things out. And as always, I will, well, not always because I missed a week now, but as most of the time, I will talk to you again next week.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.